The sound that came out of Mamie Bailey was not a cry. It was something older than crying, something that had been locked in her chest for so long that, when it finally broke free, it shook the walls of the small room behind the sheriff's office and sent the deputy scurrying out the front door with his hat pressed to his chest and his eyes cast down at the dirt road. It was the sound of a woman who had held herself together through a husband's funeral, through the reading of a will that left her nearly nothing, through the burning of her barn and the theft of her horses, through a trial where she sat straight-backed and dry-eyed while the men who had wronged her lied through their teeth and the judge believed every word. It was the sound of 3 years of silence finally tearing itself open. Sheriff Gilbert Norris did not step back. He did not reach for words the way most men did when a woman fell apart, fumbling at language like it was a tool they had never learned to use. He simply pulled the spare chair from against the wall and set it beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he sat down. He did not touch her. He did not tell her it would be all right. He did not tell her to hush. He sat the way mountains sit, with a stillness that was not indifference but something rarer, something she had almost forgotten existed. He sat with absolute, deliberate presence. When the worst of it had moved through her like a storm through open country, when the shaking in her shoulders had slowed to something she could contain, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his boots and said, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air, "You cried for everyone else. Now let me sit with you." Mamie Bailey looked at him then. Looked at him the way you look at something that does not match the shape of the world you thought you knew. And something shifted in her chest, slow as a wheel beginning to turn after a long winter freeze. But to understand what brought them to that room, to that chair, to those 7 words that cracked Mamie Bailey open in a way 3 years of grief and betrayal never had, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the August of 1883, to the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, when Mamie Bailey arrived on the back of a borrowed wagon with nothing but a trunk, a deed to 40 acres of scrubland, and a marriage certificate to a man she had known for 6 months by letter and 17 days in person. The town of Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of where the buffalo grass gave way to harder, thinner soil, the kind of land that tested a person the way fire tests metal. It had a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a general store, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a livery, and a sheriff's office that sat at the far end of the street like a period at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. The population was somewhere around 300 depending on the season, and like every town of its kind in Kansas in 1883, it was a place where people came to start over and where the past had a way of following them regardless. Mamie had come from Ohio. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, both of whom had died within 6 months of each other the winter before, leaving her with a small house that sold at a loss, a modest skill with figures she had learned keeping her father's books, and a practical, clear-eyed understanding that the life she had imagined in Ohio was no longer available to her. She had found the advertisement in a Cincinnati paper. Frank Bailey of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, was looking for a wife. He was a cattle rancher, 34 years of age, a church-going man with property and prospects. What the advertisement had not mentioned, and what 6 months of careful letters had only partially concealed, was that Frank Bailey was also a man whose prospects were considerably more hypothetical than actual, whose property was mortgaged more than he had let on, and whose personal character had a kind of slippage to it, a tendency to become someone slightly different depending on who was in the room. He was charming when charm served him. He was cold when it did not. Mamie had sensed some of this in the letters. She was not naive. But she had weighed her options with the same clear arithmetic she had used to balance her father's accounts, and had arrived at the conclusion that 40 acres of Kansas scrubland with a complicated man was better than no land at all with no prospects in Ohio. So she had come. She had married him in the Caldwell Creek church on a Saturday in September of 1882 with the minister's wife and the livery owner as witnesses, and she had set herself to the work of making something real out of what she had chosen. She had been better at it than Frank. She had a kitchen garden producing by spring, had learned to keep the books for the ranch with a precision Frank had never bothered with, had introduced herself to the neighboring ranchers' wives with a warmth that was genuine even when she was tired, and had slowly begun to understand the particular geography of Caldwell Creek, who held power and how, who was trustworthy, and who wore their trustworthiness as a costume. The man she had identified earliest as dangerous was Cornelius Hatch. He was the largest landowner in the county, a man of perhaps 50 with the kind of physical presence that came not from height or strength, but from a deep and practiced certainty that every room he entered belonged to him. He had land on 3 sides of the Bailey property. He had been wanting Frank's 40 acres for 2 years before Mamie arrived, and Frank's arrival of a wife with clear eyes and a talent for figures had complicated his plans considerably, because Mamie had taken one look at the purchase offer Hatch had put before Frank and told Frank the number was less than half of what the land was worth. Frank had been furious with her. Hatch had been something else. He had looked at Mamie across the table in a way that told her he was now paying attention to her in a very specific and very unpleasant sense. Frank Bailey died in March of 1883. He was thrown from a horse on a trail he had ridden 100 times, and his neck broke against the frozen ground. The county doctor ruled it an accident. Mamie, who had ridden out to the spot and looked at the trail and the ground, and the way the horse had been found standing not in a panic but calm and grazing, had her own thoughts. But she had no evidence, and she had no ally, and she had a husband in the ground and a ranch to keep running, and a mortgage to manage, and the creeping awareness that she was now utterly alone in a place where alone was dangerous. It was in the weeks after Frank's funeral that she first truly noticed Gilbert Norris. He was not a man who made himself conspicuous. He was 32 years old, medium height and solid build, with brown hair that had a wave to it when it grew past his ears and gray eyes the color of winter clouds that had the particular quality of seeing more than they let on. He had been the sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 3 years, having taken the position after his predecessor retired, and he had served it with a kind of quiet competence that the town had grown accustomed to and therefore slightly took for granted. He had come by the day after the funeral, hat in hand, to offer his condolences in the brief and careful way of a man who measured words because he meant them. He had asked if she needed anything. She had said no, thank you. He had nodded, put his hat back on, and left. She had watched him go and thought that he was a man who kept his inner life as carefully as she kept her books, columns straight and nothing bleeding over into the wrong space. She did not think about him romantically. She was not thinking romantically about anything. She was thinking about the mortgage, about the cattle, about the fact that Frank's brother in Missouri had written a letter suggesting he might have a claim to the ranch. She was thinking about Cornelius Hatch, who had appeared at the funeral in his best coat and offered his sincere condolences with an expression that did not quite match the words. The brother's letter turned out to be a real problem. His name was Douglas Bailey, and he arrived in Caldwell Creek in April, a month after Frank's death, with a lawyer he had hired in Wichita, and a claim that Frank had promised him a partial interest in the ranch before the marriage. The lawyer's name was Pemberton, and he was the kind of man who wore expensive suits in dusty towns and spoke in the elaborate circumlocutions of someone who had learned long ago that confusion was a useful tool. Mamie sat through the meeting in the sheriff's office, because Gilbert Norris had offered his office as neutral territory, with her back straight and her hands folded on the table, and the mortgage papers and Frank's correspondence in a neat stack in front of her. She had spent 3 nights reading every letter Frank had ever written to Douglas and every document she could find, and she had found nothing that supported Douglas's claim. What she had found instead was a series of letters from Douglas to Frank that strongly suggested Douglas had borrowed money from Frank repeatedly over several years and had never repaid any of it. She presented this information with complete composure. Pemberton tried to obfuscate. Douglas tried to bluster. Gilbert Norris sat in the corner and said almost nothing, but his gray eyes moved from one speaker to the next with an attention that Mamie noticed and found quietly steadying, the way you notice a solid wall when the wind picks up. Douglas and Pemberton left Caldwell Creek the following week without the ranch. Mamie returned to work. She hired a ranch hand, a steady older man named Orville Tate who had worked cattle all his life and who took to her clear management style without complaint. She repaired the fence line on the east pasture. She planted a second kitchen garden on the south side of the house. She went to church on Sundays, where she sat with the minister's wife, a generous woman named Clara Finch who had appointed herself something close to a friend, and she participated in the social life of Caldwell Creek with a careful, measured openness that let people in without letting them close enough to complicate things. It was Clara Finch who first said to her, in the mildly probing way of a genuine friend who notices things, "Gilbert Norris looks at you differently than he looks at anyone else." Mamie had changed the subject with a skill that Clara recognized and did not push against, but the observation settled somewhere in Mamie's mind and did not entirely leave. The real trouble came in June. It began with the horses. 3 of the Bailey Ranch horses disappeared from the pasture overnight, the fence cut in a way that was too clean and too specific to be accidental. Orville reported it to Mamie at first light, and Mamie went to the sheriff's office before the morning was an hour old. Gilbert listened to her account with the full attention she had come to expect from him, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and rode out to the property with her to see the fence line himself. He crouched over the cut wire with a focus that was entirely practical and looked at the ground around it for a long time before he stood up. "Someone who knew what they were doing," he said, "not a question. Someone who wanted it to look like strays but not too hard," Mamie said. He looked at her. Something passed between them in that look that was not quite words but was more than silence. He did not find the horses that day. He spent 3 days following what trail there was across the hard summer ground, and came back with the information that the horses had been taken southwest, in the direction of Hatch's land, and that the trail disappeared at the property boundary in a way that suggested deliberate care. He told her this in her kitchen, over coffee she poured without asking if he wanted it, because she had already noticed that he drank coffee and took it without sugar. He told her what he had found and what he could not yet prove and what he intended to do next, and he spoke to her as an equal throughout, as someone whose intelligence and interest in the matter were not to be condescended to or managed. Mamie, who had spent most of her adult life managing the condescension of men who assumed her brains were decorative, noticed this the way you notice sudden warmth after a long cold. She noticed other things too. The way his hands, which were strong and calloused and entirely capable of violence when violence was required, were also careful with her coffee cup and with the papers she spread on the table. The way he listened, not with the performance of listening that most people offered, but with an actual interior stillness that meant when he spoke he was responding to what she had actually said rather than what he had expected her to say. The way, when he was leaving and she walked him to the door, he paused on the porch step and turned back and said, "Lock your doors, Mamie," in a tone that was not quite a command and not quite a request but something in between that felt like care. She stood on the porch after he left and let herself, just for a moment, feel the warmth of being cared for by someone who she did not have to manage or compensate for. Then she locked the doors and went back to work. Cornelius Hatch moved more openly in July. He sent a man to her door with a new offer for the property, this one not even at market value, just a number written on a piece of paper with the clear subtext that it was not really an offer but a statement of intention. Mamie wrote a note on the back of the paper that said, "No thank you," Mrs. Mamie Bailey, and sent it back with the man. 2 days later, her barn was on fire. She saw it from the kitchen window at 10 in the evening, the orange light climbing the walls of the old structure with a terrible cheerfulness, and she ran out screaming for Orville, who was in his bunkhouse 20 yards away. And between them and 2 neighboring ranchers who saw the light from half a mile away, they managed to save the horses and the equipment, but not the barn itself. It collapsed in a shower of orange sparks that floated up into the black Kansas sky like bitter fireflies. Gilbert Norris arrived at 10:30, having seen the light from town, and spent the next 3 hours working beside the men, passing buckets and keeping the sparks from catching on the house roof. And when the fire was finally out and the neighboring ranchers had gone home and Orville had gone back to his bunkhouse, Gilbert stood with Mamie in the yard in front of the smoking ruin of the barn, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Hatch," she said finally. "Likely," he said. "Can't prove it yet." "What does it take?" she asked, and her voice was level, but he heard what was underneath it. He turned to look at her in the orange-gray light of the dying fire. "Time," he said. "And evidence, and patience." "I have run out of patience," she said, still level. "I would appreciate it if the law would catch up." He did not flinch from this. He absorbed it, which was different. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She went inside. She sat at her kitchen table in her smoke-smelling dress and looked at the mortgage papers for a long time, doing the arithmetic that she had been trying not to do, the sum of a rebuilt barn versus the income of the ranch versus the remaining mortgage. Then she put the papers away and went to bed, and slept the deep sleep of someone who has nothing left to spend on fear. It was Clara Finch who came by in the morning with a pie, and the information that 3 other people in town had seen Hatch's foreman riding south on the road that passed the Bailey Ranch at around 8 in the evening, 2 hours before the fire started. Clara relayed this information with a practical directness that reminded Mamie of why she had come to value her, and Mamie wrote it down in the small leather notebook she had started keeping in May, in which she had been recording dates, events, and observations about the various small acts of pressure that had been applied to her ranch since Frank's death. She brought the notebook to Gilbert that afternoon. He read every page with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and when he was done he set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment before he looked up at her. "You've been keeping this since May," he said. "Since I understood what was happening," she said. "Why didn't you bring it to me sooner?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I wasn't sure yet what kind of law you were." The silence that followed this was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty had its own kind of value between them. "And now," he said, "now I think you're the right kind," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in those gray eyes that she did not entirely understand, but that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with something she was not yet ready to name. Then he picked up the notebook. "I need to take this to the county marshal," he said. "Along with what I've already gathered, this is enough to start a formal inquiry." "How long will that take?" "A few weeks," he said. "Maybe more." She nodded. She stood. She was at the door when he said, "Mamie." She turned. He was still looking at the notebook in his hands, and he said without looking up, "Don't be alone at the ranch tonight." "Can you stay with Clara Finch?" She should have been annoyed by this. She noticed that she was not. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and still without looking up, his voice quiet and deliberate. "I'll ride past your place tonight." She left without responding, because responding would have required words she was not ready for. She stayed with Clara for 3 nights. On the second night, lying in the narrow guest bed listening to the Kansas dark outside the window, she let herself think about Gilbert Norris with a directness she had been avoiding. She thought about the way he had worked beside her in the firelight. She thought about the coffee he drank without sugar and the way he listened, and the 7 months since Frank's death in which he had been steadily, quietly present in the background of her life, never pressing, never performing, never asking for anything in return for his competence and his care. She thought about what it would mean to want something for herself. It was a thought she had not entertained seriously in years. Want, for Mamie Bailey, had been a luxury she had learned to keep in storage. You wanted what was practical. You wanted what was possible. You kept the rest in a room with the door shut. She opened the door a crack in the dark of Clara Finch's guest room and looked at what was inside, and then quietly, carefully closed it again. Not yet. The county marshal's name was August Delaney, and he arrived in Caldwell Creek in the second week of August 1883, a large, deliberate man with a sun-weathered face and the kind of reputation that preceded him into every room. He was honest. He was thorough. He was the kind of law that Mamie had not been sure existed in Kansas until Gilbert Norris had put her notebook in front of him. Delaney interviewed Mamie in the sheriff's office over the course of 2 days. He interviewed Clara Finch and the 2 neighboring ranchers who had seen the fire. He interviewed Orville Tate. He sent a deputy to Wichita to look into Hatch's financial records at the land registry. He was careful and systematic, and his systematic care, combined with Mamie's meticulous notebook and Gilbert's investigation record, began to build something that looked, slowly and convincingly, like a case. Hatch knew it. He arrived at the sheriff's office on the 3rd day of Delaney's investigation with his own lawyer, and a composed expression that Mamie, who was leaving the office as Hatch was arriving, recognized as the particular composure of a man who was considering his options and had not yet found the one he wanted. Hatch looked at her on the office steps with his lawyer at his shoulder and said pleasantly, "Mrs. Bailey, still holding on." "Still holding on," she agreed with equal pleasantness and walked past him. She heard behind her the door of the sheriff's office close and then Gilbert's voice inside, level and carrying, saying, "Mr. Hatch, have a seat." She kept walking. She felt something in her chest that it took her a moment to identify. It was not yet safety. It was something smaller and more fragile than safety. It was the possibility of safety. She held it carefully as she walked. The case built. Delaney's deputy found records in Wichita showing that Hatch had registered a claim on the Bailey 40 acres 3 weeks after Frank Bailey's death. A claim that had no legal basis, but that someone had filed on his behalf, clearly expecting the ranch to come to market under distress. The 2 men who had worked with Hatch's foreman on the night of the barn fire talked separately, neither knowing the other was talking, and their accounts overlapped in specific and damning ways. The horses that had been stolen from Mamie's pasture were found on a property in the next county that could, with some effort, be traced back to a man who had done business with Hatch's ranch on previous occasions. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which Mamie ran her ranch and began planning the rebuilt barn and kept her notebook updated and went to church on Sundays and had supper with Clara Finch twice a week, and with a frequency that she noticed and did not try to prevent, found herself in conversation with Gilbert Norris. These conversations were not planned. They happened at the general store, where they happened to arrive at the same time for their weekly supplies. They happened on the main street when she was coming from the bank, and he was heading back to his office, and they fell into step for half a block, and then a whole block, and then turned at the end of the street and walked back. They happened on her porch on 2 occasions when he rode out to update her on the investigation, and found himself still there an hour and a half after he had finished the update, talking about things that had nothing to do with Hatch or the ranch or any of the dark geography of the past year. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his mother who had been a school teacher, not unlike her father, about the 2 years he had spent working cattle drives before deciding that being the man who kept the peace was more useful than being one more cowboy on a 1,000-mile trail. She told him about Ohio, about her father's school, about the particular loneliness of being the smart daughter of a schoolteacher in a town where brains in women were considered mildly eccentric. She told him things she had not told anyone in Caldwell Creek, partly because she had not found anyone worth telling, and partly because the telling had required a listener who would not reduce what she said to something simpler than what she meant. Gilbert Norris did not simplify. He received what she said exactly as she said it, and responded to it exactly as she had said it. And this was, Mamie was discovering, one of the rarest and most significant things a person could offer another person. She was on the porch after his second long visit, watching him ride back toward town in the last of the August light, when she stopped pretending. She stopped pretending to herself that what she felt in these conversations was merely gratitude, merely the particular warmth of having an ally after a long time alone. She looked at the straight line of him on horseback against the orange sky, and she admitted to herself, with the same clear arithmetic she brought to everything, that she was falling in love with Gilbert Norris. The admission sat inside her with a weight that was not entirely comfortable. She was 7 months out from her husband's death. She was in the middle of a legal battle for her land. She was 32, no, 28. She was 28. She had turned 28 in June with a quiet birthday dinner at Clara's and a small cake. She was 28 years old with a ranch she was fighting to keep, and a heart she had kept behind a locked door for so long that opening it felt dangerous. She went inside and made herself a cup of tea and did not think about it any more that night. But she did not lock the door again either. In the 3rd week of September, Cornelius Hatch and his foreman were formally charged. The charges included arson, theft, criminal filing of false property claims, and conspiracy to defraud. Hatch's lawyer made considerable noise in the Caldwell Creek street about the injustice of it, but August Delaney was not the kind of man whose convictions were affected by noise, and the charges held. There would be a trial. Delaney told Mamie and Gilbert in the sheriff's office that it would likely be in Wichita, given the county dimensions of the case, and that Mamie would need to appear as a witness. He told her she had done something significant in keeping that notebook. He said it plainly, without flattery, which was why she believed him. After Delaney left, Mamie and Gilbert sat in the quiet of the office. The deputy was outside. The afternoon light came through the single window and made a pale rectangle on the floor between them. "It will be months before the trial," she said. "Probably," he said. "Delaney is thorough. He'll prepare properly." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I need to start rebuilding the barn before winter." "I know," he said. "You could use some help with that." She looked at him. "Are you offering?" "I know how to swing a hammer," he said, with a gravity that was not quite entirely serious. Something happened in Mamie's chest that she recognized now and no longer tried to deny to herself. She looked at the pale rectangle of light on the floor and said, carefully, "Gilbert." "Yes," he said. She took a breath. She was a woman who had always preferred honesty to management, even when honesty was complicated. "I don't know what to do with what I feel," she said. "I don't know whether this is the right time or the right place or whether any of this makes sense given the past year. I don't know whether you feel," she stopped. "I'm making a mess of this." "You're not," he said very quietly. She looked up. His gray eyes were on her with an expression that she recognized now, that she realized she had been seeing for months and filing away and not fully reading. It was the expression of a man who was trying very hard to be patient with something he wanted very much. "I've been waiting," he said, "until the timing wasn't something that would compromise you." "Compromise me how?" "You were in the middle of a fight for your land," he said. "You were 7 months from losing your husband. Whatever I was feeling, I wasn't going to say anything that could look like taking advantage of a woman in a vulnerable position. I have more respect for you than that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is possibly the most respectful thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's the least you deserve," he said. The afternoon light moved on the floor between them. Outside, a horse moved on the street and a door opened and closed somewhere in the town. The world of Caldwell Creek continued its ordinary life in total ignorance of the thing that was shifting in the sheriff's office. "What if I told you," Mamie said, "that I am perfectly capable of determining for myself when I am or am not in a vulnerable position, and that I would like you to stop waiting and say what you feel?" The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. It felt longer. "I am in love with you, Mamie Bailey," he said. "I have been for months. You are the most clear-thinking, most courageous, most quietly remarkable person I have encountered in my adult life, and I have been keeping it to myself with what I think you will agree has been considerable self-discipline." She felt the words go through her like the first real warmth of spring, the kind that gets into your bones. "Yes," she said, "I will agree it has been considerable." He looked at her. "Is that all you're going to say?" She let the warmth spread further, let it reach all the places she had been keeping cold for practical reasons. "No," she said, "I am also in love with you, Gilbert Norris. And I would have told you sooner if you had given me slightly less self-disciplined behavior to contend with." The sound he made was almost a laugh, which was the most she had heard from him in the direction of laughter, and it transformed his face in a way that did something extraordinary to her pulse. He stood. She stood. He crossed the pale rectangle of light between them and stood very close to her, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the world was very quiet and very still. "May I?" he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her very gently, with a care that was exactly like him, careful and thorough and entirely present. And it was nothing like the kind of kiss that asked for something and everything like the kind that offered it. When they separated, she stayed close to him, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and she thought that this was not the right time or the right circumstances or the right anything, and that she did not care at all. October arrived with the particular sharpness of a Kansas autumn, and Mamie rebuilt the barn. Gilbert had not been exaggerating about the hammer. He came out on his days off and on evenings when the light lasted long enough, and they worked beside each other with a companionable silence that was entirely comfortable, occasionally broken by conversation, or by Gilbert handing her a board and their hands touching in a way that was entirely ordinary, and also not at all ordinary. Orville Tate observed this development with the deep equanimity of a man who had seen most things and had opinions about very few of them. He helped with the barn, worked well alongside Gilbert, and said nothing at all about the change in the household's emotional atmosphere except for once, when Mamie came in from a long afternoon of working, alongside Gilbert, and Orville handed her a coffee and said, without looking up from the harness he was mending, "Good man, that one." This was the longest personal observation Orville had offered in 6 months of employment, and Mamie received it accordingly. Clara Finch, who had no such reticence, received the news of Mamie and Gilbert's mutual declaration with an expression of supreme satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal. "I told you," Clara said, pouring tea with a decisiveness that suggested she had been right about most things and was pleased to be right about this one. "You told me he looked at me differently," Mamie said. "That's not exactly the same as telling me." "For a woman of your intelligence," Clara said, "you were remarkably slow on this particular subject." "I was otherwise occupied," Mamie said, and there was enough true feeling behind this that Clara reached over and squeezed her hand and did not press further. November came, and with it the notification from Delaney that the trial of Cornelius Hatch would take place in Wichita in January. Mamie read the notification at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, and then set it aside and went out to look at the finished barn in the pale November light. It stood solid and new against the dry winter grass, smelling of fresh lumber, the kind of solid that things could be when people worked at them properly. She and Gilbert had fallen into a rhythm. He came for Sunday supper, which she cooked with a care she had not brought to cooking since before Frank died. He rode out twice during the week, sometimes with legitimate ranch business as an excuse, and sometimes without bothering with an excuse at all. They walked together on the main street without pretending they were going the same direction by accident. Caldwell Creek noticed and adjusted, as small towns do, incorporating this new arrangement into its understanding of itself with a thoroughness that took about 2 weeks. December brought cold and snow, and the particular isolation of a Kansas winter, which was also, Mamie was discovering, a particular intimacy. They were sitting by the fire in her front room on a Sunday evening in early December when he reached into his coat pocket and set something on the low table between them. She looked at it. A small box, dark wood, plain. She looked at him. "This is perhaps still not the right time," he said, Given that you have a trial to attend in January and a ranch to run through the winter and various other legitimate reasons to say it's too soon, I'm aware of all of those things. And yet, she said. And yet, he agreed. I don't want to wait any longer, Mamie. I'm asking you to marry me, not to solve anything, not because it makes practical sense. Because you are the person I want to spend my life with, and I'd like to start doing that as soon as you'll allow. She looked at the small box on the table. She thought about Frank Bailey and the calculation she had made in Ohio and the life she had chosen out of arithmetic. She thought about what it felt like to choose something because you wanted it, because it was real and true and yours. She opened the box. The ring inside was simple and beautiful, a thin gold band with a small garnet that caught the firelight in a way that made it look like it was burning. Yes, she said, not because it solves anything and not because it makes practical sense, because I love you and I want to start the life I'm actually choosing. He put the ring on her finger. She held her hand in the firelight and looked at it. Then she looked at him, and what she saw in his face was something she recognized now as the expression of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. They sat together in the firelight for a long time after that, talking about everything and nothing, about the trial and the ranch and what spring might look like when the hard winter was done. And outside the wind moved across the Kansas plain with a sound that was still cold, but that no longer sounded only like loss. January arrived with the trial, and the trial arrived with its own kind of violence. Not physical violence, but the violence of having your history made public, of having the worst of what had been done to you laid out in a Wichita courtroom before a judge and a jury, and a gallery of onlookers who had varying degrees of sympathy and understanding. Mamie had known it would be difficult. She had not quite anticipated the specific difficulty of watching Hatch's lawyer try to reframe her as a woman who had been incompetent and confused, who had misunderstood legitimate business dealings, who had let emotion interfere with clear perception. She sat in the witness chair and answered every question with the same clear, factual precision she brought to her accounts. But when the lawyer's questions became a sustained and deliberate attempt to suggest that she had fabricated or exaggerated the threats against her land, she felt something happening inside her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not anger, though there was anger in it. It was something older and heavier. It was the accumulated weight of 3 years of loss and fight and solitude and silence, of a husband who had not been what he seemed, of a barn reduced to ash, of horses stolen in the night, of a will that left her the land but nothing else, of a brother-in-law who had tried to take even that, of all the ways she had been told implicitly and explicitly that she was a woman alone and therefore vulnerable and therefore manageable. She answered the questions. She was composed. She cited dates from memory that matched her notebook exactly. She did not raise her voice. She did not show the thing that was happening inside her chest. August Delaney was thorough in his case. The evidence was overwhelming. The 2 men who had worked with Hatch's foreman testified. The records from Wichita were presented. The false property claim was examined by the court. The notebook, which Delaney had submitted as exhibit, was read by the jury foreman with an expression of increasing gravity. Cornelius Hatch was convicted. The foreman was convicted. The verdict came on the 3rd day in the early afternoon, and Mamie sat in the gallery with Gilbert beside her and heard it with the same composure she had maintained throughout, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing even. They were in the hallway outside the courtroom when Delaney shook her hand and told her she had been exceptional, and the neighboring ranchers who had come to Wichita for the verdict congratulated her, and the minister's wife who had come along with Clara gave her a long, warm embrace, and Gilbert stood at her shoulder through all of it with a quiet presence that was all she needed. When the hallway had cleared and it was just the 2 of them in a quiet corner with the sounds of the courthouse settling around them, that was when Mamie Bailey felt the thing that had been happening in her chest for 3 years finally, completely, come apart. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. One moment she was standing with her back straight and her hands folded, and the next moment Gilbert's hand was on her arm, and she was crying in a way she had not cried at Frank's funeral, not at the fire, not at any of the 100 moments in the past 3 years when crying would have been entirely justified. She was crying for all of them at once, for Frank, who had been flawed and had not deserved to die on a frozen trail, for the horses and the barn, and the 40 acres of Kansas scrubland she had nearly lost, for her father and mother in Ohio, for the version of herself who had done the arithmetic and chosen the practical thing and tried to make something real out of it. She did not try to stop it. She stood in the corner of the Wichita courthouse hallway and cried in a way that used her whole body, and Gilbert Norris put one arm around her shoulders and stood with his face turned toward the wall, not looking at her, giving her the privacy of his presence, which was exactly the right thing. When the storm passed, when she had come back to herself enough to find her handkerchief and do something useful with it, he guided her to a bench along the wall and sat down beside her. Close beside her, the warmth of him solid against her arm. And in the quiet that followed, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he turned to look at her. "You cried for everyone else," he said. His voice was so quiet it barely carried. "Now let me sit with you." She looked at him, at his gray eyes and the lines of his face and the patient, absolute stillness of him, and she understood that he had seen her, not the composed woman, not the capable ranch manager, not the clear-eyed witness. Her. The whole person, underneath all of those necessary performances. He had seen it all and had named it for what it was. A woman who had spent years pouring her strength into everyone and everything else, and he was offering her something she had almost forgotten was possible. Someone to be with her when it was her turn to be held. She took a shaking breath and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her properly then, and they sat there in the Wichita courthouse hallway in January of 1884, while the light came through the high windows, and the building went on about its business around them, and she let herself be held for a long time. They were married in March of 1884, in the Caldwell Creek church on a Saturday, in a ceremony that was simple and real in all the ways that Mamie's first wedding had not been. Clara Finch wept in the front pew with a happiness that she made no effort to contain. Orville Tate sat straight-backed in his good coat with an expression of profound approval. August Delaney, who had come back through Caldwell Creek on other business, stayed for the wedding and added his congratulations to the pile at the reception with a warmth that surprised no one who knew him. Gilbert had arranged with the town council to keep his position as sheriff after the marriage, the question of where they would live having been resolved by Mamie's clear arithmetic, which established that the ranch was the more practical arrangement, and by Gilbert's complete willingness to be the man who rode into town for work and rode home to her in the evenings. He built an additional room on the south side of the house that spring, while the weather was still mild enough to work comfortably, and Mamie painted the inside walls with a white that caught the Kansas light in the mornings and made the room feel like the beginning of something. The spring of 1884 was the spring Mamie had thought about during the hard winter, and it delivered. The kitchen gardens went in early. The cattle, which Orville had kept through the worst of it with remarkable skill, were healthy and producing. A neighboring rancher came to her in April with a proposal to share the cost of a bull between their 2 herds, a practical arrangement that also constituted, in the social currency of Caldwell Creek, a clear signal that she was regarded as a legitimate and lasting presence in the community. She and Gilbert had their first serious argument in May, which was about nothing and everything the way first serious arguments tend to be, which resolved itself over 2 days by means of both of them being too honest and too committed to let it run longer than it needed to. The argument was about money, specifically about a repair to the east fence that Mamie wanted to handle one way, and Gilbert thought could be handled more simply. They were both right in different aspects of the problem, and the resolution they arrived at was better than either of their individual positions, which was itself a lesson about what it meant to actually share a life with someone whose intelligence matched yours. She told him this afterward, sitting on the porch in the May evening, and he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and tenderness and said, "Are you telling me that you're right about everything, including our arguments?" "I'm telling you," she said, "that we're both right when we argue well." He considered this. "That is almost certainly true," he said, "and also somewhat annoying." She laughed. She had been laughing more this spring than she had laughed in several years, and it still surprised her sometimes, the way joy could come back when you had stopped believing it was permanent. Summer arrived, and with it a fullness to the ranch that Mamie had not seen in her time there. The new barn, still smelling faintly of fresh lumber when the heat brought the scent out of the wood, held more horses now. The kitchen gardens were producing abundantly. The house had been added to, and improved in ways that made it feel lived in and purposeful. Orville had taken on a young ranch hand as his assistant, a quiet boy named Samuel Briggs who worked hard and asked good questions, and had somewhere along the way adopted Orville as a mentor with a completeness that Orville received without comment, but with evident, unexpressed satisfaction. Mamie found out she was expecting in August. She told Gilbert on the porch in the early morning before the heat of the day had built, over their first coffee of the day, the way she had come to tell him anything important, directly and without preamble. He set his coffee down. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read and then leaned over and kissed her with a gentleness that answered the question she had not asked about how he felt. "A baby," he said when they separated. "In the spring," she said. "I've counted forward. April, I think." "A baby in April," he said, as if he was acquainting himself with the shape of it. "Are you all right?" she asked, because directness went both ways. "I am very much more than all right," he said. "I am trying to contain an undignified amount of happiness," she smiled. "Don't contain it on my account." He did not contain it. He spent the rest of the morning in a state of contained brightness that Orville noted and responded to by being approximately 2% warmer than usual throughout the day, which for Orville constituted an unambiguous celebration. The pregnancy was straightforward, the way things sometimes are when a person is well and strong and living in a place that suits them. The Caldwell Creek doctor, a capable man named Dr. Farrow, saw her monthly and reported with consistent satisfaction that everything was proceeding as it should. Mamie continued to run the ranch through the fall and early winter with some modifications, handling the accounting and planning with Orville while redirecting the more physically demanding work. She continued to go to church, to have supper with Clara, to be a presence on the main street of Caldwell Creek with the unhurried confidence of a woman who knew she belonged where she was. Gilbert was careful with her in the way that was not restriction but attentiveness. He noticed when she was tired before she admitted it. He took on the tasks she had quietly moved away from without drawing attention to the shift. He sat with her in the evenings with his hand over hers and talked about names with the same thoughtful seriousness he brought to everything, and they went through possibilities over several November evenings until they had a list that felt right. "Thomas," she said one evening, "for a boy, after my father." "Thomas," he said, turning it over. "I like it." "And for a girl," she said, "Eleanor." "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You have a preference?" "No," he said honestly. "I only want them to be well, both of them." She squeezed his hand. "Both of you," she said. "I'm a them too." "Both of you," he agreed, and brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles in a gesture that was, she had come to understand, his particular way of expressing things that were too large for words. Thomas Norris was born in April of 1885, in the room Mamie had painted white, which was full of morning light when he arrived. He was healthy and loud, both of which Dr. Farrow confirmed with professional satisfaction, and Gilbert held him in the first hour of his life with an expression on his face that Mamie, watching from the bed with the particular exhaustion of new motherhood, thought she would remember as long as she lived. Clara Finch came by that afternoon with enough food to last 3 days, and the declaration that the baby looked exactly like Gilbert, which Gilbert received with obvious pleasure, and Mamie could neither confirm nor deny as she felt her eyes closing involuntarily. Orville Tate came by in the evening, hat in hand, stayed approximately 4 minutes, looked at the baby in its cradle with an expression of profound assessment, said, "Good," and left. It was the highest praise in Orville's vocabulary, and everyone present understood it accordingly. Caldwell Creek in 1885 was a town in transition, as all Wild West towns of the era were, the frontier edge slowly being replaced by something more settled, more institutional, more connected to the wider world by the railroad that had come through the county 3 years earlier. There were conversations in the town council about a school building separate from the church, about a proper telegraph office, about civic improvements that spoke of a community that was beginning to think in terms of permanence. Mamie became involved in the school discussion that summer because she had a schoolteacher's daughter's investment in the question, and because Thomas was only a few years away from needing one. She joined the committee and contributed with the precision and clarity that the committee, after an initial period of adjusting to having a woman among them who did not confine herself to polite agreement, came to rely on. Gilbert observed this with a warmth that he expressed most often in small ways, arriving at committee nights with supper ready when she came home, or mentioning to people in his daily rounds that Mamie Bailey Norris was the clearest thinker on that particular committee, in a tone that made it a statement of fact rather than a compliment. The Caldwell Creek schoolhouse was built in the fall of 1885 on a lot donated by two of the more established families in town, a building that was not large but was solid, with proper windows that let in light from the south and a stove in the corner for winter. The teacher they hired was a young woman from Kansas City named Miss Ada Webb, who was 23 and possessed of both academic credentials and an energetic teaching style that immediately won the children's attention and the community's approval. Mamie and Ada Webb became friends over the course of that winter, an unlikely friendship made inevitable by the fact that they were two of the most intellectually serious women in Caldwell Creek and recognized each other immediately. Ada came for supper on Thursday evenings, which became a standing arrangement, and these evenings extended into discussions that Gilbert participated in with the patient, interested attention that characterized him, and that Thomas eventually fell asleep to in his cradle while the adults talked about education and law and the nature of the West and where all of it was going. By the spring of 1886, the ranch had grown. Mamie had used the settlement from the Hatch case, which had included damages for the barn and the stolen horses, along with 2 seasons of good cattle income, to expand the herd and hire a second permanent hand alongside Samuel Briggs. The mortgage that had been hanging over the property since Frank Bailey's time was paid off in full in March, and Mamie set the final payment receipt in her desk drawer with a quiet satisfaction that she did not need to make a performance of, because it was entirely sufficient to itself. She stood at the window of the ranch house on a warm March evening after Thomas had been put to bed and looked out at the land, all 40 acres of it, and thought about the woman who had come here from Ohio 3.5 years ago with a trunk and a deed and a practical calculation. She thought about the barn that had burned and the barn that had been built, the trial and the verdict, the grief and the love and the child sleeping in the next room. She thought about sitting in the Wichita courthouse hallway and the voice that had said, "You cried for everyone else. Now let me sit with you." Gilbert came to stand behind her close enough that she could lean back against him, which she did. His arms came around her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "That I would not have chosen any of the hard parts," she said, "and that the hard parts were part of what brought me here. Here being where?" He said with a gentleness that was really asking what she meant. "Here," she said. "This, you, Thomas, the land actually being ours, the barn standing." He held her a little tighter, Outside, the Kansas evening was settling into its particular blue-gray quiet, and the grass was beginning its spring movement, and everything was extraordinarily ordinary in the way that life becomes when it is actually good. "I love you, Mamie," he said. "I love you, Gilbert," she said. They stayed at the window for a while, and the land held its breath around them the way it does in the evenings before full dark, and the world was contained and whole. The summer of 1886 brought a particular event that neither of them had anticipated. Douglas Bailey, Frank's brother who had come to Caldwell Creek 3 years earlier with his Wichita lawyer and his claim on the ranch, wrote a letter. Not a legal letter, a personal one, addressed to Mamie, in handwriting that had a tentative quality to it that the earlier correspondence had entirely lacked. He was in difficulty, the letter explained. His wife had left him. He had lost his work in Missouri. He was not asking for money. He was not asserting any claim. He was only, he wrote, very near the bottom of what he could manage alone, and he did not have anywhere else to turn, and whatever had passed between them before he hoped she might be willing to read this letter to its end. Mamie read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she handed it to Gilbert without comment and watched him read it. He set it down and looked at it for a moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about what it costs a man like that to write a letter like that," she said. "I'm thinking that he was wrong and also desperate, which are two different things." "They are," he said. "I'm not a forgiving person by nature," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But I don't think the two of us being well and the ranch being settled costs me anything to write back." "No," he said. "I don't think it does," she wrote back. Not with warmth that was not there, but with honesty which was. She told him that the past was past and that she held no ongoing grievance. She told him something about her life now, about Thomas, about the ranch. She did not invite him to come, because that would have been more than was true. She wished him better circumstances and meant it in the careful, limited way that is still something. Douglas Bailey wrote back once more, some months later, with a tone that had more steadiness to it. He had found work. He was managing. He asked after Thomas in a way that suggested he found the idea of a nephew more comprehensible than the idea of his brother's complicated widow. And Mamie wrote back with a brief description that was entirely benign and entirely sufficient. They exchanged letters perhaps twice a year after that, in a correspondence that was no more than it was and no less. Two people maintaining a thin thread of connection across the distance of what had happened between them, which was perhaps more than most people managed in similar circumstances. 1986 also brought the question of whether Gilbert wanted to keep the position of sheriff indefinitely. He was offered that fall a different kind of position, a seat on the county commission that was being established as the institutional structures of the region matured. It would have meant leaving the sheriff work, which he had done for 6 years, and which had shaped the man she had married. He thought about it for 2 weeks, during which he said little about it, which Mamie recognized as his version of deep internal deliberation. "Tell me what you're actually thinking," she said one evening, not for the first time during those 2 weeks, but with enough quiet patience behind it that this time he answered. "I'm thinking about what I'm useful for," he said. "Sheriffing is something I know how to do and do well. The commission would be different. I would be starting at the beginning again." "But," she said, because there was one. "But the county is changing," he said, "and what it needs is changing, and maybe the most useful thing I can do is change with it." She thought about this. "I think," she said carefully, "that you would be good at both, but I think you would be more fulfilled by the thing that challenges you. You're not a man who likes to stay where it's comfortable." He looked at her. "Is that true? You came to Kansas," she said. "You chose the job with the most resistance. You married a woman who argues well. None of these are the choices of a man who prefers comfort." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The county commission." "Yes," she said. "If you think, I've told you what I think," she said. "Now you tell me what you want." He looked at the table for a moment and then looked up. "I want the commission," he said. "I think it matters more. I think the legal and civic structure of how this county grows matters for everything else, for people like you who fought for their land, for people who don't have the resources to fight. I want to be in that room." "Then be in that room," she said. He accepted the position in October. The new sheriff of Caldwell Creek was a man named Henry Clover, who had worked as a deputy in the next county for 3 years, and who Gilbert spent a month transferring knowledge to with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. The transfer was complete by November, and by December, Gilbert was attending county commission meetings in the county seat with the particular alert engagement of a man who has found the work that suits the next stage of what he intends to do with his life. He was good at it. Mamie had expected him to be, because she understood by now the particular quality of his intelligence, which was structural, which meant he saw how things connected and what held them together, and where the weak points were that would become problems later. This was useful in law enforcement and more useful still in civic governance, where the choices made in one meeting had consequences that rippled outward over years. She sat with him in the evenings when he came home from commission meetings and listened to what he reported, and offered her analysis with the clarity that he had come to rely on with the same ease with which she now relied on his patience and his steadiness. They had become, in the natural way of two people who are genuinely suited, essential to each other's thinking in ways that went beyond the personal and into something collaborative and intellectual. A partnership that was also a love affair, and also the running of a ranch, and the raising of a son, and the building of a life that was, by any measure, fully and remarkably theirs. Thomas Norris, at 2.5, was a child of extraordinary energy and considerable charm, qualities that Mamie recognized as Gilbert's in different proportion, and that she found, in practice, both delightful and exhausting. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination, which was a combination that kept everyone in the household alert. He had attached himself to Orville Tate with a devotion that Orville received with the stoic warmth of a man who had been alone for many years, and did not know what to do with having a small person follow him around the ranch yard, except to teach him things, which Orville did with a thoroughness that eventually produced a 2-year-old who could identify a horse's hoof problem and explain it in complete sentences that startled everyone who heard them. The spring of 1887 brought a development that surprised Mamie and Gilbert equally. Ada Webb, the schoolteacher, became engaged to a man named Lawrence Prout, who ran the telegraph office that had finally been properly established in Caldwell Creek. Lawrence was a gentle, bookish man whose passion for the new technology of telegraphic communication matched Ada's passion for education in its intensity, and who looked at Ada the way that Mamie recognized because she had been looked at the same way. The engagement was announced at a small supper at the Norris Ranch in April, and Mamie produced a celebration dinner that Clara Finch declared was the finest she had eaten since her own wedding 20 years earlier. The summer of 1887 was the summer that Mamie's arithmetic revealed that the ranch had, for the first time since she had arrived in Caldwell Creek, produced enough income to be genuinely comfortable. Not wealthy, not in the way that Cornelius Hatch had been wealthy before the trial and the conviction and the dissolution of his holdings, but comfortable, which was a word that meant something specific and real to a woman who had done the numbers for 5 years and always found them tight. Comfortable meant the mortgage was gone, and the cattle were strong and the hands were paid, and there was a sum left over that could be set aside and could grow. She told Gilbert on a Sunday in July while they were walking the east fence line together, a habit they had developed of walking the ranch together on Sunday afternoons while Orville and Samuel kept Thomas company, and she told him the numbers with the same precision she used for everything. He listened. He looked at the fence line and the summer gold grass and the blue sky above the Kansas plain, and when she was done he said, "We built this." "We did," she said. "You built most of it," he said. "Before I was any part of it. The foundation, maybe," she said. "What it is now is both of us." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her with the expression that she knew now meant he was feeling something too large for his usual economy of emotion and was finding the words for it. "I want you to know," he said, "that every day of this is something I did not know was possible for me. Before you, I thought I knew what my life was. I thought I had made it into something functional and honorable and sufficient. And then you walked into my office with a mortgage you were fighting to keep and a clarity that could cut glass, and I understood that sufficient was not anywhere close to what I actually wanted." She felt the warmth of it all the way through. She put her hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palm. "You were so patient," she said, "with me and with everything. I don't know that I have told you how much that mattered. When I was fighting alone, just knowing that you were honest and that you saw what was happening clearly, it made the difference between managing it and being crushed by it." "You would not have been crushed by it," he said. "You are not the kind of woman who gets crushed. Everyone has a limit," she said. "You helped me not find mine." He covered her hand with his, pressing it against his heart. Around them, the Kansas summer went on doing what it did, enormous and golden and indifferent to individual lives in the way of all beautiful landscapes. But they were two specific people standing in the middle of it with a specific history and specific love, and that made the enormity something you could stand in rather than be diminished by. Late in the summer of 1887, Mamie began to suspect she was expecting again. By September, she was certain enough to tell Gilbert, and his response was even less contained than it had been with Thomas, which she had not thought possible. He picked her up carefully, mindful of what she was telling him she was carrying, and she laughed out loud, which Thomas, who was in the yard with Orville, heard and came running to investigate. "Mama's laughing," he reported to Orville with the grave urgency of a 3-year-old relaying important information. "So I hear," Orville said. "Why is Mama laughing?" "Because she's happy," Orville said. Thomas considered this. "Is Papa making her happy?" "I expect so," Orville said. Thomas seemed to find this entirely satisfactory and went back to whatever he had been doing. Orville returned to his work with the exact expression he always wore, which was no expression, which was also every expression. The second baby arrived in April of 1888, which felt almost impossibly symmetrical to Mamie, Thomas having been born in April of 1885. This time it was a girl. She was born in the same white room as her brother, in the same spring light, with Dr. Farrow in attendance, and Clara Finch waiting in the front room with the particular anxiety of a woman who loved the family inside as her own. They named her Eleanor, as they had agreed. Thomas met Eleanor with the suspicious reserve of a 3-year-old encountering something that was going to change his life in ways he could not yet calculate. And then, within approximately 48 hours, with a protectiveness that startled everyone including Thomas himself, he stationed himself beside the cradle at intervals and explained things to Eleanor with great seriousness. Things about the ranch and about horses and about Orville and about how the world worked, in the detailed and earnest way of a child who has recently discovered that he knows things. Gilbert watched his son explain the nature of horses to his infant daughter one evening in the spring light and said to Mamie in a low voice, "He talks more than I do." "He talks more than anyone," Mamie said. "He gets it from me." "You don't talk that much," he said. "I talk exactly as much as is required," she said. "He has not yet calibrated the required amount." "He'll learn," he said. "He'll learn it from you," she said. "You are demonstrably the right person for that lesson." He smiled, the real smile that she had come to love, the one that reached his eyes and changed his face from serious to something warmer. "That might be the most backhanded compliment you've ever given me." "I meant it entirely as a compliment," she said. "I know you did," he said. "That's why I'm smiling." The spring of 1888 settled into summer, and summer moved through the ranch with the ease of a season that has learned the shape of the place it is occupying. The cattle were well. The gardens were producing. Samuel Briggs, the young ranch hand who had been working under Orville for 5 years, had become a fully capable rancher in his own right, which Orville acknowledged with his highest compliment, which was to stop explaining things and simply hand Samuel the relevant responsibility. Mamie went back to the county school committee that fall, this time with a leaner on her hip for the early meetings, until the baby was old enough to be left with Clara for the afternoon. She pushed through a proposal for an expanded school curriculum that included the practical subjects she had found most useful in her own life: accounts, land law, basic surveying, subjects that the children of ranching families would actually need in the lives they were going to live. There was resistance from the more traditional members of the committee, who felt that the classics and scripture were sufficient. Mamie worked through the resistance with the patient, evidence-based precision that had characterized everything she did, and by January of 1889, the expanded curriculum was approved. Ada Webb Prout, as she was now, taught the new subjects with the same energetic thoroughness she brought to everything, and Miss Ada, as the children called her even after her marriage, became as essential to Caldwell Creek as the church or the general store. Gilbert, on the county commission, had been working through 1888 and into 1889 on what he considered the most important thing the commission could address, which was the formal establishment of property rights procedures that were clear, accessible, and not vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that had been used against Mamie and against others like her. He had seen, in the Hatch case and in other cases he had investigated, and in the reports from neighboring counties, how the ambiguity of property law in frontier territories was consistently exploited against people who lacked resources or connections, against women, against small ranchers, against people the system had not been designed to serve. He presented his proposal to the commission in February of 1889 with the thoroughness and clarity that Mamie had helped him refine over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, and the proposal was adopted with amendments in April. It was not a perfect instrument, he knew, because no legal instrument was. But it was better than what existed, and it would protect people who would otherwise be unprotected, and that was what law was for. He came home the day the vote passed and found Mamie on the porch in the April light with a leaner on her lap and Thomas at her feet, doing something complicated with 2 sticks and a length of rope, and he stood at the foot of the porch steps and told her what had happened. She looked at him with those clear, intelligent eyes, and she said, "Good. Now come sit down, Gilbert, you have had a long day." He came up the steps and sat beside her, and Thomas immediately abandoned the sticks and rope to climb into his lap, which Gilbert accommodated without interrupting his account of the commission vote, and a leaner reached toward him from Mamie's lap with the imperious reaching gesture of a 1-year-old, who finds the universe generally insufficient to her requirements. He held a leaner with one arm and Thomas with the other, and Mamie sat beside him, and the Kansas spring evening made its unhurried way across the sky, and everything was entirely whole. The year 1889 brought the formal organization of Oklahoma Territory to the South, which changed the character of the region as land rushes and new settlement shifted the population dynamics of the whole southern plains. Some of Caldwell Creek's transient residents moved on toward the new opportunities, which tightened the town's population, but also settled it, leaving behind the people who had chosen permanence over possibility. Mamie and Gilbert Norris were among those who had chosen permanence, and the permanence they had chosen had grown into something that the town had organized itself around without quite noticing it happening. The Norris Ranch was a landmark. Mamie's work on the school committee and various other civic matters was a known and valued contribution. Gilbert's presence on the county commission was understood as a kind of moral anchor, a person whose judgment could be relied upon because it had been tested and had not failed. They were not important in the way that people with money or political ambition are important. They were important in the way of load-bearing things, the kind of presence that holds the structure together quietly and completely without requiring acknowledgement of the fact. There was an evening in October of 1889 when Clara Finch came for supper, as she did most weeks, and the conversation turned to the years since Mamie had first come to Caldwell Creek. Thomas was 5 and Alina was 18 months, and Thomas had been told that adults were talking and had taken himself off to Orville's bunkhouse with the cheerful adaptability of a child who has a second home in the ranch yard. Alina was asleep. Clara, who had known Mamie through all of it, said, "Do you remember the woman who came to my house the night after the barn burned, with the smoke still in her hair and that expression like she was solving an equation that wouldn't balance?" "I remember," Mamie said. "I thought then," Clara said, "that I had never met anyone who was simultaneously as strong and as alone as you were." "I was," Mamie said. "And now," Clara said, with the warmth of someone who already knew the answer and wanted to hear it said. Mamie looked at Gilbert across the table, the small table in the kitchen of the house they had expanded and painted and filled with the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built. She looked at him with the complete knowledge of 6 years, the arguments and the agreements, the losses and the gains, the 2 children sleeping down the hall, the land that was finally and entirely theirs, the commission votes and the school curriculum and the letters to Douglas Bailey and the Sunday walks along the fence line and the evenings by the fire and the morning coffees and all of it, every ordinary and extraordinary piece of all of it. "Now," she said, "I am the least alone I have ever been." Gilbert looked back at her with the expression she had first seen in the Wichita courthouse hallway and had been seeing ever since, the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and knows it absolutely. Clara Finch pressed her handkerchief to her eyes in a way that she would later describe as entirely non-sentimental, which no one believed. The winter of 1889 settled over Caldwell Creek, and the ranch with the particular peace of a winter that falls on a prepared household. There was wood enough and food enough and warmth enough, and Thomas spent the cold months adding words to his already considerable vocabulary and demonstrating for Alina, who was now toddling around the house with a determination that reminded everyone of her mother, the various important facts about the world that he had accumulated. Alina received this education with a skeptical expression that also reminded everyone of her mother. Gilbert read in the evenings by the fire when the commissioner's work allowed it, the kind of reading a man does when he is trying to understand things, history and law, and the occasional novel that Mamie recommended, and that he approached with the same serious engagement he brought to everything. They read to each other sometimes, which was a habit they had developed in the 2nd year of their marriage, and which Thomas had begun to participate in by falling asleep to the sound of it, which they both privately regarded as one of the finest things in their lives. Mamie began, in the winter months, to write something that was not a letter and not a notebook entry, but something more deliberate. She had been thinking for some time about what she had learned in the 5 years since coming to Kansas, about land law and women's property rights, and the particular vulnerabilities of women alone in a legal system that had not been designed with them in mind. She was not a lawyer, and she had no pretensions toward being one. But she was someone who had lived through the specific problem and who knew exactly where the gaps were, and she thought that what she knew might be useful to someone who was in the position she had been in. She wrote it as a practical document, the kind of clear, useful prose her father had taught her to value, and she showed it to Gilbert in February, and he read it with the total attention that meant he was taking it seriously. And when he set it down, he said, "This needs to go somewhere that people can actually find it." "I thought," she said, "that the county commission might have some use for it." "The commission," he said, "and the women's groups that have been forming in Wichita. And the newspapers, if you're willing." She considered this. "I'm willing," she said. "You should put your name on it," he said. "It has my name on it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just making sure you know I want it there. Not Mrs. Gilbert Norris, Mamie Bailey Norris." She looked at him. "You noticed I wrote it that way." "I notice everything about you," he said, without drama, as a simple statement of fact. She sent the document to the Wichita paper in March of 1890 with her name exactly as she had written it. It appeared in print 6 weeks later, and generated a correspondence that she did not anticipate, Letters from women in towns across Kansas who had experienced similar situations and who found in her document both practical information and the particular comfort of knowing they were not alone in the experience. She answered every letter. It took her 3 months to work through them all, in the evening hours when the children were in bed, and the ranch accounts were balanced, and the house was quiet. And she wrote back to each one with the same care and specific attention she would have wanted someone to extend to her when she had been the woman alone in the smoke-smelling dress sitting at the kitchen table with the mortgage papers. Gilbert watched her do this with an expression of something she could only call reverence, which she found both moving and mildly embarrassing. "Stop looking at me like that," she said one evening. "I'm not looking at you any particular way," he said. "You are," she said. "You are looking at me the way you look at things you consider remarkable." "That is because you are remarkable," he said. "Stating a fact is not looking at you any particular way." She pointed her pen at him. "You are the most frustrating man I have ever loved." "You have only loved 2 men," he said. "I am the second. The sample size is insufficient for that comparison." She laughed, the real laugh that she had been laughing more freely than she could ever remember, the laugh that Thomas had inherited and that Alina was beginning to develop, a bright, warm sound in the Norris kitchen. "Go to sleep, Gilbert," she said. "I'll wait," he said, settling back in his chair by the fire. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who had sat beside her in her worst moment, and offered her the simple, extraordinary gift of his presence. This man who had kept his patience through years of her careful walls and let her decide her own time and her own terms. This man who had worked beside her in firelight and built her a barn and raised her son and held her daughter and made her laugh every day, in the small, real way of a person who intends to keep doing it. The winter continued. Spring came as it always did, the grass greening across the flat Kansas distance, and the sky going wide and blue, and the whole tremendous ordinary miracle of another year beginning itself again. Thomas turned 6 in the spring of 1890 and started school properly, in the schoolhouse that Mamie had helped to build, and where Ada Prout taught him with an enthusiasm for her work that made learning feel like something you did, because you wanted to rather than something done to you. He came home in the afternoons full of information that he delivered to Alina with full confidence that she would find it as interesting as he did. Alina, who was 2, received this information with the focused attention of a child who is deciding what she thinks about things. Mamie stood on the porch in the spring afternoon and watched her children in the yard and felt the fullness of it, the full specific weight of what this was. Not the life she had calculated, not the life she had managed or compromised into shape. This life, which had been fought for and grieved for and built day by day with her own hands and Gilbert's and Orville's patient, steady contribution and Clara's generous friendship, and the whole community of Caldwell Creek that had slowly, genuinely become her home. She heard Gilbert's horse on the road before she saw him, the particular rhythm of it that she had learned to recognize at distance. He came up the road in the late afternoon light and saw her on the porch and raised a hand, and she raised hers, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world and also not ordinary at all. He came up to the porch and dismounted and tied the horse and came up the steps and stood beside her, looking at the yard where Thomas and Alina were conducting a negotiation about something involving a stick that appeared to be ongoing and complex. "Good day," she asked. "Productive," he said. The water rights ordinance moved forward. "Good," she said. "And you?" She thought about the letters she had answered that morning, and the garden she had planted in the afternoon and Alina's new word, which was mine, delivered with Thomas's own tone of supreme conviction. "Good," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, warm side against warm side, watching their children in the late Kansas light. The sun was moving toward the horizon, the particular long western sunset that made everything look golden and specific and permanent, and the ranch was whole around them, the barn standing and the cattle settled and the fence lines intact, and everything that had been broken and rebuilt was bearing weight the way rebuilt things sometimes do, stronger at the mended places than it ever was before. "I think about that day sometimes," she said. "In Wichita." "I know," he said. "When you said those words," she said, "I felt like someone had finally seen the whole thing, not the part I showed the world, the whole thing." "You deserve to be seen," he said, "all of it." She looked at the yard, at Thomas explaining something with a seriousness that made Alina's expression become thoughtful and concentrated. She thought about all the women who had written to her this winter, the women who had been alone in ways she recognized, fighting in ways she recognized, and the small things she had been able to offer them through the document and the letters, the practical information and the knowledge that someone had come through the other side. "I want to do more of it," she said. "The writing. The information for women who need it. I want to make it more formal somehow." He was quiet for a moment, thinking with her rather than ahead of her. "A pamphlet maybe," he said, "something the women's organizations in Wichita could distribute." "Yes," she said, "and I'd like to talk to someone about whether there's a way to make it part of what the school teaches. Land law, women's property rights, basic legal information that people in this territory should have." "I know the right person on the commission to talk to about the school aspect," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." She felt his quiet amusement in the arm around her shoulders. "Partnership," he said. "Always," she said. Alina in the yard had apparently resolved the stick negotiation in her favor and was now proceeding toward the porch with the stick in question held aloft like a scepter, her 18-month walk still slightly uncertain but her direction entirely clear. Thomas trailed after her with the expression of an older sibling who has been outmaneuvered and is reconsidering his strategy. "Mama," Alina announced from the bottom of the porch steps, holding up the stick. "Very nice," Mamie said. Alina presented the stick to her father, who accepted it with appropriate gravity. "An excellent stick," he said. Alina was satisfied. Thomas came up the steps and leaned against Gilbert's free side with the casual confidence of a child who has never doubted his welcome there. The Kansas evening gathered itself around them, the four of them on the porch, the land spread out below the fading sky, the lights beginning to come on in the far distance where Caldwell Creek was settling into its own evening. The ranch was quiet. The world was quiet. Everything that had needed to be built had been built, and everything that had needed to be healed had been healed, and everything that had needed to be found had been found. Mamie Bailey Norris stood on her porch with her husband's arm around her and her children around her feet and her land stretching out before her, 40 acres of Kansas that were wholly and finally and permanently hers, and she breathed in the spring air and let it be exactly what it was. Complete, whole, hers. The story of a woman who had come from Ohio with a calculation and had stayed for a life. The story of a man who had waited with a patience that was also a form of love. The story of 7 words said in a Wichita courthouse hallway that had cracked something open that turned out to be not a wound but a door. The door was wide open now, and the light coming through it was the light of a life that was genuinely, remarkably, and entirely good.